The particle picked up speed and retraced its path back and forth, up and down, side to side at varying levels, crossing its own path over and over and over again until it was traveling so fast that it began to appear next to itself as if it was a separate particle. By the time it achieved infinite speed, the void seemed to be full of flickering, ghostly particles, an illusion created by the single particle being everywhere at once. It began to cross its own path in different patterns, and where it crossed 3 times in all directions, the ghostly aspect of the particle at the crossing point took on the appearance of solidity, having been reinforced by the multiple crossings. The solid points began to form geometric shapes, which evolved into fractal patterns that became familiar objects: rocks, trees, the surrounding countryside and, last of all, Willa and Holly. Their bodies manifested as a collection of subatomic dots created by the infinitely fast particle and quickly filled in along with the forest environment in which Willa had begun her Divinorum journey. Willa blinked back to awareness, stunned. She locked her eyes on Holly's enigmatic smile and ran her hands over her own body. She turned her attention to the nearest yew tree and placed her palm on its crinkled bark. "We are all one," Willa whispered with newfound awe. "I can't track where I end and the trees begin." "Good," Holly said with a hint of pride in her pupil. "Now your journey toward becoming a cryptic can truly begin." Chapter 11. Maelstrom. The imagination has no limits other than those you imagine it has. The Book of Paradox by Sassafras the Sage. Kale crawled out from under the engine room control console in Koro's stealth ship, several circuit boards clutched in his hand. Koro's brow creased in a deep furrow. "You just disabled the weapons." "I need to boost power to the engine and coherence field. It has to come from somewhere. Besides, we shouldn't need weapons on this trip," Kale said as he headed to the engine chamber. "Better to have and not need, than need and not have," Koro grumbled. Gar watched closely as Kale made the adjustments to the tangle of conduits, magnetic rings and stainless steel cylinders that made up the engine's plasma flow regulator. "I still don't get this Q-jump idea. Is it different than hyperspace?" "Yes," Kale said as he routed power through the borrowed circuits. "It's quantum space, a completely different concept." Gar looked at Dennick and shook his head. He might as well be speaking Jarushka. "I don't know what that is," Kale said. Dennick jumped in. "Slang for one of the alien slave worlds in the Empire. Their real name's unpronounceable, as is their language. Jarushka means gibberish." Kale continued to work as he spoke. "Do your people know anything about quantum physics? Wave-particle duality, quantum tunneling, superposition, entanglement, coherence?" Koro searched his memory. "I once read about some experiments a few sci-techs were conducting that had concepts like that. I think it was part of what they called the deep reality theory, but the overlords believed it was a dead end and focused them on creating weapons instead. They also tried making more efficient gravity drives so they could conquer more worlds, but they discovered it takes too much energy to go faster." "Koro's ship here is about the fastest there is," Gar said. "And, of course, no one can get past the energy barrier that surrounds the Empire without going through the maelstrom," Dennick added, "and you've already experienced how dangerous that can be. In fact, the stronger the gravity drive, the more turbulent the crossing. I'm guessing the gravitational fluctuations in the maelstrom are magnified by the strong gravitic field of your engine," Kale mused. "Exactly," Koro agreed. "We must dial the power back when we cross through, and even then, the odds aren't good, so no one really tries anymore. We used to have gravity drives before the invention of the Q-jump," Kale said. "Nothing wrong with gliding along in a faster-than-light bubble of spacetime. I kind of miss it. Watching the stars blue shift as you race toward them and red shift as you speed away. It's quite breathtaking." Gar exchanged a glance with Koro. "So if we understand you, this Q-jump technology allows you to avoid traveling in spacetime altogether. One moment you're here and the next, you're there. Kale completed his adjustments and turned to Gar. Yes. It still takes a few jumps to get anywhere really far away, but it's much faster than warping space. Gar shook his head. You'll have to explain it to me when we have more time. Kale patted the ship's engine. We'll need to check the quantum resonance calibrations next, but she's basically ready to go. What about making the ship think? Gar said. We won't have what we need to do that until we get to Earth. Oh, Gar said, somewhat disappointed. Kale glanced up at Gar. May I ask you a personal question? A bit wary, Gar gave a slow nod. How did you lose that eye? Gar laughed. I'd love to tell you a story about how I was injured as I fought bravely in one of the uprisings against the overlords, but the truth is, I was repairing an engine and I stupidly dropped a plasma torch. The beam grazed my face. Kale smiled at Gar's ability to laugh at his misfortune. Sorry. Ah, it's nothing. I'd gladly give my other eye if it would end the war. Kale felt a deepening respect for Gar and all the other resistance fighters he'd met on this lonely outpost in deep space, far from their homeworld. Despite being used to centuries of peace, he hoped Earth would be willing to do something to help the League reclaim their planet and free the other slave worlds from the Archon's grasp. Kale stepped up to the control console and brought it to life. He turned to Brim. If you help with the calibrations, we'll be ready to depart after evening meal. We've already had our rations, Brim said. Dennick responded to Kale's puzzled frown. The Archon sentries sometimes capture our supply ships. We usually only have enough food to eat once a day. Every Orion Kale had seen since he was captured had been thin, and he came to realize that was their natural condition. However, although he'd been with the League for nearly a week, it suddenly dawned on Kale just how gaunt and underfed everyone in the Resistance was. But Alara's been feeding me 3 times a day. You needed to heal. Your intel is vital to our cause, Dennick said. Willa stood on Marrowbone Bridge, gazing out to sea. The town was bustling with activity, but the buzz of a dozen different dialects was drowned out by Willa's thoughts. Holly approached and stood beside her at the rail, sharing the view. I had a visit from a puka last night, Willa said. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders at the admission. I know, said Holly. The trees, remember? Is there anything you don't know? I don't know what I don't know, Holly said in typical cryptic fashion. If the sages who became wraiths are responsible for shifting Earth's course down this parallel path, isn't there something we can do to shift it back? Holly thought for a moment. Perhaps. But the shifts have been subtle, accumulating over a long period of time. Unlikely we'd be able to shift back to the original path. We only need to find a path that doesn't include the invasion. But how would we know what other circumstances might crop up instead? Holly said. The alternate paths might lead to something even worse. Then what do we do? Willa said, feeling more frustrated and helpless by the minute. Let's talk to Alder. He might have some ideas. Odd ones, no doubt. Willa said. Actually, Alder's not so bad. Most sages I've known are usually off in their own little worlds, searching for secrets in some remote location or holed up in their inner sanctums, completely absorbed by their latest exploration into arcane knowledge. They're often uninterested in the affairs of others. However, Alder's certainly taken an interest in you. I guess I should be flattered, Willa said, not really caring. You should be cautious, Holly said. Alder's a good man and I'm grateful for his help. However, like Celine, he most likely has a secret agenda. Stay alert. Willa nodded and silently wondered if everyone had a secret agenda. She bit her lip as she felt the weight of the expectations thrust on her young shoulders by Holly, Celine, Alder, the rest of the quorum and even the elementals. She resented the responsibility even as she feared failing them. Willa shifted her gaze to the horizon, her jumbled thoughts slowly coalescing into a secret agenda of her own. Rowan's ship popped into normal space just a few light-years from the Orion Nebula. This close, the nebula filled his view screen with a riot of colored gases set ablaze by clusters of newborn stars. Rowan and Thorne gaped at the spectacular stellar nursery. "Corvus, start scanning for Father's ship," Rowan instructed. "Scanning," the computer replied. "How long will this take?" Thorne said. "As long as it takes," his brother said, eyes locked on the scanning data. "Sounds like something a cryptic would say." Rowan smiled to himself and went to the back of the cabin. He removed 2 small green metal containers from a storage locker, handed one to Thorne. "Time for evening meal." "I'm not hungry," Thorne protested. "We have no idea what condition or situation we'll find Father in," Rowan said. "We may need to act quickly. Best to keep up our strength. Eat." Thorne opened his box, took out a greenish-brown stick the size of a candy bar, sniffed at it. "What's this?" "Nutrients," Rowan said as he bit into his own stick. "It's good. Spacers call them zipsticks." Thorne took a small bite and chewed. "Couldn't you have packed some fresh vegetables? This is a rescue mission, not a cruise. Besides, we may be out here a while. The sticks will sustain us longer." Thorne and Rowan settled in, eyes on the multicolored nebula on the screen as they munched their meager meal. The Stargazer Tavern was perched on the edge of the Grand Canal at the south end of Marrowbone Bridge. The 2-story structure had been carved out of an immense granite outcrop and outfitted with old-fashioned ripple glass windows. A wide flagstone patio was sheltered from inclement weather by a wooden arbor and warmed by 2 large river rock hearths. The common room was lit by a brace of luminaria globes, their warm glow flickering like the firelight in the central hearth. Humans, hybrids and aliens populated the tables and booths where they drank frothy brews and golden nectars and engaged in lively conversations in a half-dozen languages. Stargazer, a 5-foot-tall female shapeshifter and the owner of the tavern, stood behind a polished oak bar and grew to 6 feet in order to more easily converse with a couple of tall alien customers. She had cinnamon skin like alder and the typical all-black eyes of her kind, matched by long, dark tresses that framed a pixie face. However, another identical stargazer was also standing over at a table, taking another customer's order while another was simultaneously serving drinks to a different group at a corner booth. Her ability to split herself into several copies not only marked her as entering the next phase of transformation from shapeshifter to sage, it also allowed her to fill every job in the tavern. Holly, Alder and Argus sat around a large wooden table framed by a curved bay window. Holly sipped a cup of mint tea, Argus, his huge bulk resting on a sturdy bench, crunched on a brace of fat, orange carrots and Alder swirled a glass of ruby wine. One of Stargazer's doppelgangers passed by their table on her way back to the bar with a tray of empty glasses. "Can I interest any of you in a slice of berry cobbler? Made it fresh this morning," Stargazer offered in her thick Scottish accent. Argus held up 2 thick fingers as he continued to chew on a mouthful of carrots. Stargazer nodded. "Your usual double order. Anyone else?" "We're good, Stargazer," Holly said. "Thank you." "Right. One of me will be right back with that cobbler," Stargazer said to Argus as she headed off toward the bar. Alder hardly paid attention to the conversation, mesmerized as he was by a flickering luminaria globe. "I find it fascinating that, nearly 1,000 years after the discovery of electricity, we're still so enchanted by fire that we even use electricity to simulate it," Alder mused. Holly nodded. "You can take a person out of nature, but you can't take nature out of the person." Argus grunted agreement with a mouth full of carrot. "Susquehannock discover fire long time ago, before Anu come." Alder turned to the Sasquatch. "I've always been curious, Argus. Why didn't the Anu turn all your people human?" "Some Susquehannock had gift of phase shift to parallel world. Anu not find them in other reality. After Anu leave, my people return. All Susquehannock born after that have gift of shift. Well, I for one am glad your people are still around, Alder said, raising his glass. Holly toasted with her tea. Argus tapped Alder's glass with a carrot and crunched it between his huge teeth. Stargazer returned and set a double portion of juicy berry cobbler in front of Argus, who inhaled the aroma with deep satisfaction. Alder looked at the dessert, then up at Stargazer. Oh, that looks wonderful. I'll have. Before he could finish, a second Stargazer placed another slice of cobbler on the table. This one has a touch of cinnamon, Alder. I know you like it that way. How thoughtful. Thank you, Alder replied. Both Stargazers smiled, turned and headed toward different tables. Holly eyed Alder with a coy smile. I think she likes you. Which one? Alder said as he eyed the various Stargazer clones in the tavern. Just think of the possibilities, he mused. Holly shoved the plate closer to him. Eat your cobbler, old man. Outside, across from the inn, Willa watched her 3 mentors framed in the window. Satisfied they were settled in for the evening, Willa headed for the lodge farther down the bridge, careful not to make eye contact with the few remaining night owls making their way home. Alder sipped his wine and considered the problem at hand. Divining the outcomes of multiple parallel realities is challenging, even for the most accomplished of sages. You were right to tell Willa that shifting our course could result in something far worse than what she saw in her vision. The best we can do is use the information to prepare. What do you have in mind? Holly said. Well, we've never had to use our abilities in battle, but they can certainly be. What was the ancient term? Ah, yes. Weaponized. Not good to make weapons, Argus grunted. I mean we become living weapons, Alder clarified. Sages can manifest objects from parallel realities, shift the fabric of time and space. With sufficient preparation and imagination, we could create all sorts of obstacles for the invaders. Shapeshifters can impersonate their leaders, issue false orders, cause confusion and chaos, that sort of thing. Trees and animals can overhear their plans and tell Holly and other cryptics. Then there are the elementals. They have some unusual skills that could be harnessed to the cause. Argus grunted his approval. Holly raised an eyebrow at Alder. You have a devious mind, Alder Redwood. Are all sages so cunning? No. It's a special gift, he said with a smile. I'll likely have to train the others to think differently. Overcoming 700 years of tradition won't be easy. Holly returned the smile. I can't think of anyone better suited to the task. Neither can I, Alder said without a trace of irony. Willa reached the double wooden doors at the front of the lodge, but they were locked. She glanced at the building nearest the lodge, a shop with a second-story veranda about 15 feet from the lodge's steep, pitched roof. Willa scrambled up one of the veranda's support posts, went to the railing and took stock of the wide gap between the 2 buildings. The railing was too high to vault over, even at a dead run. Willa looked around and spotted a pair of shutters on the shop's upper-story window. She carefully removed the hinge pins and propped one of the heavy shutters against the rail to form a ramp. Willa jammed the 2 pins in between the veranda's floorboards just behind the shutter so it wouldn't slide backwards. She walked to the far end of the veranda, took a few deep breaths and focused all her attention on the makeshift ramp. Willa took off in a sprint, legs pumping as fast as they could. Her feet hit the ramp. She sailed over the gap, landed high on the lodge's roof and slid down the slate shingles toward the edge 20 feet above the decking below. She halted her slide on a copper rain gutter and started to climb toward an upper window when a shingle gave way under her foot. It skittered over the edge and shattered on the deck. Willa tried to brace herself, but several more shingles broke free. She slipped back toward the precipice, heart pounding as she imagined plummeting to her death. A furry paw grabbed her hand and stopped her a split second before she flew off the roof. Willa's gaze lifted from a pair of clawed feet that dug into the shingles, to Rusalka's scowling ruby-red eyes. You should look before you leap, girl. The puka pulled Willa up to a window ledge where she was able to grab on. "Thank you," Willa said, trying to catch her breath. She jimmied the window open, stopped and said, "Wait. Have you been following me?" "Of course," Rusalka sniffed. "Many elementals want to know more about the attack you saw in your vision." "That's why I'm here." Willa slipped through the window onto an upper-story loft. The puka followed her inside. They made their way to a staircase and descended into the great room where the cauldron of divinorum still bubbled over a low fire. The golden cup was on the mantel. Willa grabbed it, scooped up the thick liquid and drank it down. Her face scrunched from the bitter brew, but she filled the cup again and forced herself to swallow before she went back a third time. "What are you doing?" Rusalka said, his nose wrinkling at the foul odor. "I figure the more I take, the more I'll see," said Willa. She set the cup back on the mantel and sat down in the center of the circle on the floor. Willa closed her eyes and waited. Within 3 heartbeats, her body stiffened like she was being electrocuted. Her head was thrown back, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. Rusalka backed away, alarmed. "What's wrong with you?" Willa was too deep in the divinorum trance to hear the puka. She was frozen in place, staring through a rift that formed in the air just below the ceiling as the depths of space opened to Willa's expanded senses. Rowan's ship still floated against the backdrop of the Orion Nebula as he examined several trajectories on his monitor. "Why are we still sitting here?" Thorne said in a sour tone. "Readings show some kind of gravitational anomaly ahead. It's making it difficult to lock onto Father's signature. So we came all this way for nothing." Rowan input a few calculations on his console. "I'm not giving up yet." A beep on the console was followed by Corvus's smooth electronic voice. "Sensors are registering a 98% spectrographic match to the composition of the target ship's hull." "Father's ship?" Thorne said, his melancholy shifting to hope. "Insufficient mass," Corvus clarified. Rowan felt his stomach lurch. "Debris?" "Affirmative." "Plot a course," Rowan ordered. "I should warn you," Corvus said, "the anomaly will make navigation quite challenging." "Understood. Do it anyway." Adjusting course. The view screen overlaid the new course on the stars and the ship glided toward the debris in the midst of the anomaly. The cabin shuddered, making Thorne nervous. "Can't we just pull the debris to us with a tractor beam?" "Not at this distance," said Rowan. The ship lurched more violently. Rowan and Thorne grabbed onto support beams to steady themselves. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," Thorne said. Rowan's jaw was clenched, a mix of fear and determination. "I'm not going back without knowing what happened to Father." Thorne nodded, trying to match his brother's stoicism, but the confidence drained from him as the ship lurched again. "Shield to maximum," Rowan shouted. "The shield is at maximum," Corvus responded. Attempting to compensate for gravitational variances. "Strap in," Rowan said to Thorne. The boys belted themselves into their seats. A burst of electromagnetic energy erupted around the ship, glowing like an aurora. A spider web of electric arcs danced across the hull and the ship tumbled off a gravitational cliff. Rowan and Thorne barely stayed in their seats as the ship plunged down the gravity well, on a collision course with the large chunk of debris from their father's ship. They plowed through the wreckage. Their external communications array was struck and destroyed in a shower of sparks. Half of Rowan's control console went dark, interior lights flickered and shorted out. An alarm assaulted their ears. The ship's wild gyrations snapped their belts and the boys were slammed against the cabin bulkheads. "Inertial stabilizers," Rowan yelled. At maximum, the computer shot back, its voice filled with static. "Gravitational stress on the hull approaching critical. Get us out of here. Navigational sensors are offline." Thorne tried not to throw up. "We're going to die, aren't we?" "Father survived. So can we," Rowan said, trying to convince himself as much as Thorne. The ship continued to shudder and lurch, systems shorted and exploded, showering the boys' battered bodies with searing hot globules of fused nano-glass. Artificial gravity cut out. The boys grabbed onto the nearest support beams and hung in mid-air. The main view screen flickered and went dark. The shuddering stopped. Rowan and Thorn floated in apprehensive silence, bathed by the eerie red glow of the few remaining emergency lights. "Ironic," Thorn said. "What?" "Father could make it home, only to find out that his plonky sons died in uncharted space." "Yeah," Rowan grudgingly admitted, "I guess this was pretty stupid." "Well, you know what they say." "What's that?" "Good judgment comes from making mistakes and mistakes come from bad judgment." Despite his fear, Thorn laughed. "Let's hope we survive long enough to learn our lesson." The boys reacted with surprise as the main view screen flickered back to life, filling the cabin with cold blue light. Several glowing lines traced different trajectories against the stars. All paths ended abruptly within the maelstrom, except for one that charted a course all the way through. "Corvus. Follow that path," Rowan shouted. The ship righted and slipped through the roiling gravitational rapids. The cabin shuddered and shook, but held together as Rowan and Thorn held on tight to the support beams. After what felt like an eternity, the tiny ship emerged into a calm expanse within the eye of the gravitational storm and came to a full stop. "Good work, Corvus," Rowan said. "Thank you." "It wasn't me," the computer responded. "What do you mean?" "I didn't lay in the course. It came from somewhere outside." "A transmission?" "No. The information simply appeared in my databanks." Rowan and Thorn exchanged a glance, at a loss to explain it. The stars on the view screen gave way to a rotating, kaleidoscopic energy pattern, followed by a distorted, yet familiar voice that filtered through the static. "Thorn? Rowan? Can you hear me?" Thorn was both surprised and relieved. "Willa? Is that you? Where are you?" Back on Earth, in the Quorum Lodge, Willa's eyes were solid black voids filled with stars. Her trance-like stare was focused on a swirling vortex of energy that penetrated the ceiling and revealed Rowan's ship in the depths of space as though it hung mere yards above the roof. Rusalka kept his rose-colored eyes on Willa and fidgeted, growing more nervous by the minute as Willa spoke to Thorn through the wormhole. "I'm in the Quorum Lodge in Port Dublin," she said. The puka followed her gaze yet saw nothing but the wooden ceiling over his head. "Who are you talking to, girl?" Rusalka demanded. Willa ignored Rusalka and continued the conversation only she could hear. "Stay where you are. Help is on the way." Rusalka startled as the main doors were thrown open. Holly, Alder and Argus entered and froze as they beheld the puka and Willa, locked in her divinorum trance. Alder's golden eyes filled with inky blackness and the portal became visible to him. "She's created a quantum rift." "Seal it," Holly said. In a blink, he willed the portal to collapse in on itself and the vaulted ceiling was once again overhead. Alder's eyes returned to normal. Although the portal was gone, Willa remained in a deep trance. Holly rushed to her side. "Willa? Can you hear me?" Willa was oblivious to Holly's presence. The cryptic turned to Rusalka. "How much did she take?" "You mean that foul-smelling soup?" "3 cups. The puka said. 3. Why didn't you stop her?" Argus scowled at Rusalka, a deep rumble in his throat. "Puka not belong in lodge." "Don't growl at me, you furry oaf. This wasn't my fault. You're the ones who ought to be watching her. She nearly got herself killed sneaking in here. I saved her from breaking her fool neck." "We're grateful to you for that," Alder said, cutting off another growl from the fuming Sasquatch. "And you're right. We're responsible for keeping an eye on the lass." Rusalka humphed and gave Alder a curt nod of thanks. Holly turned her attention to Argus. "Is there anything you can do?" "Not first time this happened with eager apprentices." Argus stomped into an adjacent storeroom and emerged clutching a dun-colored root. He grabbed a stone mortar and pestle from a shelf, bit the root into manageable chunks and spit them into the bowl. Argus added a dipper of water and mashed the root to a pulp. The Sasquatch went over to Willa and gently took her face in his large hand as he lifted the bowl to her lips and forced her to drink the milky pulp. They all held their breaths and, within moments, Willa's eyes returned to their natural, golden hue. She blinked back to awareness, regarded the faces of her relieved mentors and the ruffled puka, went pale and bolted for the door. Willa leaned over the bridge railing and violently purged into the sea far below. After several minutes, her stomach empty, Willa collapsed to the bridge deck, her back against the railing, completely spent. Holly brought her a cup of cool water. Willa took a few cautious sips as color flooded back into her cheeks. "What were you thinking?" Holly said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry you," said Willa, still somewhat weak. "Alder says you opened a portal through Q-space. Not only could you have been killed, the entire lodge and half the village could have vanished into another dimension." I reached Thorn and Rowan. "They're safe now." "Did you hear what I just said?" "I had it under control," Willa said, slightly miffed. "Did you, now?" Holly said with a brittle bite. "How did you know it would work?" "I just knew. Despite your genetic connection to the Anu, you're still an apprentice and you need guidance. You've got a lot to learn about being a cryptic, let alone a sage. I saved my friends' lives and I didn't need to talk to any trees to do it. Doesn't that count for something?" "Willa," Holly said, more shocked than angered at Willa's impertinence. "It's not just about them. Look at you. You're peeled. That much divinorum could have scorched your nervous system. I'll be Hickory in no time. Just leave me be." Willa stood and walked away over Marrowbone Bridge. Alder, Argus and Rusalka joined Holly. "Please look after her," Holly said to the puka. Rusalka gave her a quick nod and followed Willa at a respectful distance. "No mischief," Argus grumbled. Rusalka scowled at Argus over his shoulder, stuck out his tongue and continued after Willa. Alder glanced at Holly's worried expression. "Any of us might have done the same to save our friends." "That's what worries me," Holly said. "She's just as stubborn as I was at her age. I once underestimated the consequences of a choice and it nearly cost me everything I held dear. I'm afraid she's making the same mistake." Alder nodded. "Most who become old and wise start by being young and daft." Holly kept her eyes on Willa's receding back, a feeling of dread in the pit of her stomach. Alder's eyes were also on Willa and Rusalka as they stepped off the far end of the bridge and headed down the path. He placed a comforting hand on Holly's shoulder. "Life is a harder teacher than either of us," he said. "Life is a harder teacher than either of us," he said. "She gives the test first. The lessons come afterwards." Chapter 12. Reunion. After humans became used to the hybrid presence on Earth, they were given a list of all humans whose genetic material had been used by the Welks to create the hybrids. Eventually, most of those humans came to accept the hybrids as their own offspring, which allowed Earth to feel that human civilization was part of an extended galactic family. That opened the way for additional contact from a variety of alien races, which eventually led to the formation of the Interstellar Alliance. Excerpt from A Hybrid History by Holly Cotton. Rowan's ship floated serenely in the Maelstrom's eye, badly damaged but safe for the moment. Inside the cabin, Rowan tinkered with the artificial gravity circuits. Thorn hovered, weightless and helpless, as he watched his brother work. The field snapped on and their feet landed firmly on the deck. He turned to Thorn, who grabbed a medkit and attended to his bruises. "How was Willa able to do that?" Rowan said. "I don't know. That's the kind of thing only the most powerful sages would be capable of. Her training hasn't gone that far." Rowan turned his attention to a cracked nanoblock. "Corvus, do we have enough power for a Q-jump?" "Maybe one, if you tap power from the shield coils," Corvus said. but it won't matter if I can't get a navigational lock with all the gravimetric interference. So even if we repair all our systems, we're going nowhere. Correct. A beep interrupted the exchange. Proximity alert. Sensors are reading an object on an intercept course. More debris? Thorne said, dreading a replay of their recent ordeal. Unclear, the computer said, but it's big enough to be a ship. Father's ship? Rowan said with guarded hope. Unknown configuration, Corvus replied. Maybe another ship stuck here like us, Thorne offered. Is it close enough for visual? Rowan said to Corvus. The main screen crackled to life, filled with static. Rowan made a few adjustments and the image cleared, revealing a dark, menacing craft shaped like a spearhead. They look friendly, Thorne said sarcastically. They may be the only help within several light-years, Rowan reminded him. Or they might be the ones who captured Father, Thorne shot back. A beep drew Rowan's attention to his console. They're hailing us. A silent conversation passed between the brothers as they weighed their options. I don't see that we have much choice, Rowan concluded. If we don't answer, they'll probably board us anyway. Thorne reluctantly nodded. Rowan tapped his comm link. Koro's sharp features filled the screen. Identify yourself, Koro demanded. They speak English? Thorne whispered, puzzled. Rowan shrugged and faced the screen. My name is Rowan. This is my brother, Thorne. We're searching for... Rowan? Thorne? Cale's voice filtered through the speakers just before he stepped into view, his face a mix of disbelief and elation. Rowan and Thorne reacted together. Father. Cale was filled with a storm of emotions. What are you doing here? Are you all right? How did you know? Never mind. Right now, I'm just happy to see you both. Is your airlock working? Rowan grinned from ear to ear. You heard him, Corvus. Activating airlock, the computer responded. A smooth section of Corvus's hull extended and transformed into a cylindrical docking airlock. Koro's ship maneuvered alongside. Their docking ports lined up. Corvus's docking tube morphed to fit the alien airlock and formed an airtight seal. Rowan and Thorne waited by the inner hatch as the airlock pressurized. The hatch opened like an iris and Cale stepped through. He engulfed his sons in a hug and kissed their faces, his cheeks wet with tears. You're really here, he kept repeating as though afraid he might wake up from a dream. We're here, Father, we're here, Thorne assured him, his own eyes moist. Cale pulled back and frowned at Rowan. Is this what you call taking care of your brother? His ire shifted to Thorne. Where's your common sense? You need to grow up. Cale turned back to Rowan. Who gave you authorization to be out here? Don't you know how dangerous? Cale stopped. The stricken expressions on his sons' faces melted his heart. He looked at them, burning their faces into his memory. He hugged them again, flooded with relief, then stood back, still fixed on them. You've both grown so much. Rowan studied the scars on Cale's face. You've changed as well, Father. Thorne's eyes welled up. I'm sorry. Cale dismissed Thorne's apology with a wave of his hand. I'm the one who owes you both an apology, leaving you alone for so long. It wasn't your fault, Rowan said. Cale nodded. What's done is done. The important thing is we're together now. Dennick, Gar and Brim stepped through the airlock and kept a respectful distance. Cale wiped his tears away and smiled. This is Dennick, Gar and Brim. I owe them my life, Cale said. These are my sons, Rowan and Thorne. Dennick and Gar gave the boys a nod, but Brim extended his hand and clasped Rowan's forearm. I'm very excited to meet you. He clasped Thorne's arm in the same manner. Thorne winced from his bruises, but Brim seemed not to notice. Both of you. Your fathers told me so much about you, I feel we're already brothers. Good to meet you, Brim, Rowan said. We're very grateful you saved Father, but I'm afraid we won't be going home anytime soon. Kale nodded. The anomaly. We call it the maelstrom, Gar added. Not to worry. We recently received a message, don't ask me from where, that uploaded the calculations we need to compensate for the changes in gravity. Willa, Thorn blurted. Willa? Kale said, confused. What's she got to do with this? We're not sure how, Rowan said, but she sent us a message that charted a course to this region just in time. If it wasn't for her, you would have found nothing but a cloud of debris instead of our ship. Gar looked around the cabin, impressed despite the damage. So, this is one of your sentient ships, is it? At your service, the computer chimed. My name is Corvus. Gar exchanged a look of surprise with Dennick. Right. That'll take some getting used to. If you'd be so kind as to transmit your new calculations to me, I can chart a course for Earth, Corvus continued. Sure. No problem. Gar headed back through the airlock, slightly unsettled by the computer's inhuman voice. Dennick took another look around and followed Gar back to the spear. Brim smiled at Rowan and Thorn.
I can't wait to see your home world.
We're not sure how, Rowan said, but she sent us a message that charted a course to this region just in time. If it wasn't for her, you would have found nothing but a cloud of debris instead of our ship. Gar looked around the cabin, impressed despite the damage. So, this is one of your sentient ships, is it? At your service, the computer chimed. My name is Corvus. Gar exchanged a look of surprise with Dennick. Right. That'll take some getting used to. If you'd be so kind as to transmit your new calculations to me, I can chart a course for Earth, Corvus continued. Sure. No problem. Gar headed back through the airlock, slightly unsettled by the computer's inhuman voice. Dennick took another look around and followed Gar back to the spear. Brim smiled at Rowan and Thorn. I can't wait to see your homeworld. Your father said it's quite beautiful. I'm looking forward to meeting more. Earthians? Rowan nodded. Earthers will do. Or Terrans. That's a more ancient term. What about your homeworld? What's it like? Brim's smile faded. I've never set foot on Zos and most likely won't until our people are free from the Archon's tyranny. Rowan and Thorn turned inquisitive faces to their father. Kale sighed. It's a long story. Willa wound her way through the yew forest that stretched between Port Dublin and her home. Rusalka remained some distance behind her, but always within eyeshot. You can stop following me, Willa said. I'm just going home. Why are we walking? The puka griped. There's a perfectly good shaddock not a mile from here. It helps me think, Willa said, annoyed at having her thoughts interrupted by idle chatter. Now please, leave me alone. Rusalka plucked a pebble from the forest floor and chucked it at Willa. It smacked her in the back of the head. Ow! What was that for? Earth's in danger and you're moping around in the forest like we have all the time in the world. We need to find out more. How am I supposed to do that? Holly will never let me back in the lodge by myself after what I just did. Willa plunked herself down on a moss-encrusted rock and sulked. The puka squatted on his haunches a few feet away and scowled. A soft breeze rustled the leaves as an accompaniment for the steady chirping of forest crickets. Lost in thought, Willa barely noticed when the symphony stopped. Rusalka's nose twitched, his fur bristled as the evening's warmth was replaced by an unearthly chill. Willa shivered, her senses alert. She and Rusalka jumped to their feet, wary as the sound of the wind gave way to an eerie wail. At first, it seemed to come from everywhere, then coalesced to the narrow space between two tall yew trees. A pair of glowing white eyes opened in the shadows. Willa took a step back, but Belladonna the Banshee floated toward her and fixed her malevolent gaze on Rusalka. How dare you enter my beloved woods? She lunged at Rusalka with murderous rage, but her ephemeral form passed through the puka without harm. Rusalka's furry lips curled into a feral snarl. You see? Rusalka said to Willa, I was right to keep this vengeful creature from becoming a wraith. Belladonna's ghostly body flared with electric fury. Vengeful. I deserve to avenge myself after 300 years. Who are you to determine my fate? I was protecting my people. Protecting the earth. The puka shot back. You were playing with forces beyond your ken. Belladonna let loose an ear-splitting wail and rushed at Rusalka again. Despite her fear, Willa leapt between Rusalka and the banshee, hands wide in supplication. Belladonna, please don't. As the banshee passed through Willa's body, her ethereal form crystallized. Suddenly solid, she smacked into the puka and they both went tumbling. Belladonna thudded to the ground and stared in amazement at her hands, no longer transparent. She stood, wobbly at first, and looked down at her bare feet, at the prints they left in the soft soil. How? Belladonna's shock gave way to amazement. Giddy with delight, she danced around and touched her face, her long white hair, her hands and the trees, reveling in the physical sensations. She turned to Willa. You healed me. Brought me back. How is this possible? I'm not sure, Willa confessed. When you passed through me. My teacher said I have a rare genetic marker from the ancient Anu. Maybe it affected your ethereal form somehow. Belladonna swung around to face Rusalka, her anger flaring to life. You'd better run, little rabbit, because when I catch you. Rusalka scrambled to his feet, but before she could make a move, Belladonna doubled over in pain. Her body slowly returned to her ghostly form. No. She screamed as her feet lifted from the ground. No. She reached for Willa, who quickly backed away. She hovered on the evening breeze, her eyes pleading. Bring me back again. Willa, no. Rusalka shouted. The banshee's eyes flared in anger, but Willa quickly intervened. I'll help you if I can, she said, on one condition. Belladonna's anger subsided. She floated toward Willa. Anything. My friend, Thorn Ashgrove and his brother Rowan went into space to find their father. Can you tell me when they'll come back to Earth? I'm a banshee, not a fortune teller. I've heard stories, rumors really, that being halfway between the living and the dead, banshees can peer through time and space at will. Isn't that how you know someone's about to die? Belladonna considered, then said, what you ask isn't easy, but I can try. Her eyes threw daggers at Rusalka, then flickered back to Willa. She added, but if I do this, you must promise to make me mortal again. Rusalka took a few cautious steps closer. Willa. It's okay, Willa said. She turned back to the banshee. Your word you won't try to become a wraith again. You're asking two favors, said the banshee. One for me and one for him, Willa said, pointing to Rusalka. Your word or the deal's off. Belladonna scowled at Rusalka but nodded. 300 years in limbo is hell enough. I want nothing more to do with the spirit world until I die as a mortal. You have my word. Do I have yours? Since I don't know how I made you mortal the first time, I don't know if the cure can be permanent. I understand, the banshee said. I'm only asking that you try. I'll do my best. You have my word on that, Willa assured her. The banshee rose into the air, her head arched back, her ghostly eyes glowing with ethereal light. She peered into the star-filled heavens and, with great effort, unraveled the fabric of space-time. Rowan's and Koro's ships emerged side by side from the swirling eddies of the maelstrom into normal space and glided among the stars. Rowan, Thorn, Kale and Brim were glued to the main viewer as Corvus mapped a trajectory back to Earth. I've transmitted the route to Koro's computer, Corvus said in his matter-of-fact tone, but with their level of technology, we'll need to make several shorter jumps to reach Earth so they can keep up with us. That's okay, Rowan said, smiling at his father and brother, we're in no hurry. As the two ships sped off through space, another stealth ship, similar to Koro's, floated just inside the edge of the maelstrom far behind them. On board, Gant studied Corvus's map on his own view screen. He turned to Haldane, a taciturn soldier who occupied the pilot's seat like it was a second skin. You sure they can't detect us? They have no idea we picked up their transmission? Haldane kept his jade eyes on the readouts. I moved the ship back inside the maelstrom, where their sensor beams will be scattered. When we follow, we'll run cold and silent inside a null spot in their own gravity wake, half a light-year behind them, transparent as the vacuum of space. Willa and Rusalka stared up at the Banshee as she floated back down toward them and hovered a few feet off the ground, her eyes filled with worry. Willa took her expression for failure. Nothing? The vision was unclear, Belladonna said. I sense they're safe and on their way home, but... Rusalka puffed up at the Banshee's hesitation. You're just telling Willa what she wants to hear so she'll help you. I gave you my word, Belladonna said, and I'm telling you the truth, but there's something else coming with them. Something dangerous. Belladonna held Willa in her gaze. You know I can sense death approaching, but I've never felt anything so powerful, so dark, so final. Willa shivered as she recalled her nightmares. Nothing else? Belladonna shook her head. I'm sorry. Willa inhaled with an air of determination. Thank you. A deal's a deal. I promise I'll try to find a way to make you mortal again. Big mistake, Rusalka said. Belladonna's rage flared. She quickly passed through Willa and landed with a solid thud on the ground in front of the surprised Puka. Belladonna punched Rusalka with all her strength and knocked him into the dirt. She leapt on top of him, raked his face with her sharp talons over and over, drawing blood as the Puka screamed and passed out. Willa grabbed the crystallized specter and pulled her off Rusalka. Belladonna sublimed back into spirit and floated into the air, a wicked smile on her ghastly face as she glared down at Rusalka's unconscious, blood-soaked body. Willa knelt at the Puka's side, checked to make sure he was still breathing and turned toward the Banshee, furious. You gave us your word. I never said I wouldn't give that nasty little beast a licking. I've been waiting to do that for 300 years. If you want my help, you leave him alone. I'll give you 1 week to make good on your promise. A week? Willa protested. I need more time to figure this out. And I want time to live again before calamity falls upon us, Belladonna said. If you saw death coming to us all, why would you want to be mortal again? I'd rather die than be stuck like this for eternity, the Banshee said. And if I don't deliver? Willa said, defiant. Belladonna let out a howl that shook the leaves from the trees. Willa covered her ears to no avail. The Banshee's shrill wail stabbed into her brain like a cold steel blade. Even in the midst of searing pain, Willa felt a brief pang of envy that Rusalka's unconscious state spared him from this agonizing torture. Belladonna stopped. Willa's ears rang in the deafening silence. Fail me and I'll make sure every living soul in New Dublin, including your precious teacher, goes deaf as a doorknob. 1 week. The Banshee drew a symbol out of glowing energy in the air with her finger. A dot within a triangle within a circle. Draw this and call my name. I will come. Belladonna became pale as moonlight and faded from sight. The glowing symbol hung in the air for a moment and faded out as well, throwing the glade into darkness. Willa shook her head to clear her mind. She gently cradled Rusalka in her arms. It was strange, holding this powerful elemental being as though he was nothing more than a doll. A breeze ruffled his fur and her hair and reminded Willa that despite the differences between them, she and Rusalka shared a natural bond that anchored them to all living things on Earth. She stood and stumbled along as she carried the unconscious Puka down the forest path toward the Shattuck half a mile away. Chapter 13. Suspicion. In any relationship, conflict often begins, not from what is actually said, but from what is left unsaid. The Book of Paradox by Sassafras the Sage. Rusalka awoke in Willa's hammock, his wounds dressed with an herbal salve. His ruby eyes flickered around the unfamiliar room until they came to rest on Willa, asleep on a pile of blankets on the floor. The puka tried to sit up, moaned as his head began to spin, and quickly lay back down. Willa stirred at the sound, rose and took stock of her unwilling patient. She padded over to a wall and placed 3 fingers on the cool, crystalline surface. Chamomile tea. A small opening appeared in the wall and presented Willa with a glass of steaming liquid. She took it to Rusalka and helped him lift his head. "Drink," she said softly. The puka sniffed at the tea and took a cautious sip. Willa eased his head down and set the glass on the floor just as her mother rose into the room on the spiral staircase. "Good morning," Lily said with a smile that lit up the room. "How's our houseguest?" Rusalka glanced around the white nano glass room and grumped. "You call this a house?" Willa threw him a withering look. Back to his usual rude self. The hammock wobbled as Rusalka tried to sit up again. Still dizzy, he lay back down, one furry foot hanging off the edge of the hammock. "How did I get here?" "I carried you," Willa said, failing to hide her cheeky tone. "You're heavier than you look. Carried through the woods like a helpless pup. If my people hear of this, I'll never live it down. It's your own fault for goading the banshee. And you're welcome, by the way." "Fine. Now we're even. Happy?" Lily's eyebrows rose. "Banshee?" Willa knew that tone. She sighed. This was going to be a long morning. Koro's dark, spearhead-shaped ship floated high above Saturn, flanked by Rowan's and River's smooth, crystalline ships and the 5-faceted, gem-like crafts of the rescue squad. River studied Kale's scars on his view screen. "The Council can't overlook the fact that Rowan and Thorn violated several protocols to search for you," he said. "They'll have to appear before the Council to answer for their actions." Kale nodded. "They saved my life. I'll stand by their side and I'll also vouch for our guests. All that aside, I'm relieved that you're safe, Kale. Welcome home." Rowan took his father's place in front of the view screen. River continued. "I trust you'll follow me back to the spaceport?" "Of course, Master Hillycrissing. I didn't mean to cause you any." "You can explain yourself to Brahma Kamal." River cut the view screen off and smiled to himself. He knew a mandatory appearance before the head of the Contact Council was enough to unnerve the most seasoned pilots. He almost felt sorry for Rowan and Thorn. Almost. River tapped his comm. Bryony Bracken, captain of the rescue squad, appeared on his view screen. Her alabaster skin and snowy mane made Bryony's lavender eyes seem all the more shocking. "Perfect timing. I was just about to contact you, Master Hillycrissing. Captain Bracken, may I suggest you instruct 2 of your ships to remain on patrol in case any more unexpected guests show up?" Bracken nodded. "I was thinking the same thing. If our telepathic link gets any stronger, we won't need the ship's comm system anymore." Bracken out. The screen went blank and River tapped his control console. "Let's go home, Rigel." Charting a course, the computer responded. River's ship and 3 of the rescue squad vessels sped away from Saturn, followed by Rowan and Koro. 2 squad ships remained in orbit over the ring planet, their sensors on high alert. The entire quorum of 9, along with Willa, Lily and Rusalka, were gathered around a large nano glass table that extruded from the floor in Willa's home to accommodate the additional guests. "This is far more serious than I thought," said Holly, half to herself. "The Banshee actually spoke to you?" Celine said, her gaze fixed on Willa. "She confirmed your vision of Earth's fate?" "Amazing," Alder said, interrupting, much to Celine's annoyance. "Belladonna Bloodroot hasn't spoken to anyone in 300 years. Encantado, the shapeshifter, slapped his palm on the tabletop. Never mind that. Did the banshee see anything specific? Willa cleared her throat, slightly nervous. Only that Thorn and Rowan were bringing danger with them. Holly chimed in. River will be escorting the Orion representatives to the council chamber within the hour. Brahma has asked the quorum to attend the meeting, to see what we may be able to sense of our guests. Willa, he would like you and Rusalka there as well. Rusalka stiffened. Me? I need to get back to warn my people. Exactly, and you want to have as much detailed information as possible, yes? Rusalka's silence was a grudging admission of Holly's logic, and she took it as such. She turned her attention back to Willa. Regardless of the way you went about it, there's no denying that the Divinorum opened your senses to an extreme degree. Maybe you'll spot something we can't, so be alert, little fox. Willa nodded, relieved to be partially back in Holly's good graces while simultaneously wishing Holly hadn't used her nickname in front of the quorum. Eridani, the other nocturnal, addressed the gathering in a voice like liquid mercury. Are we pretending to ignore what happened when the banshee came in contact with Willa? Precisely. Celine said, snatching the conversation away. There's much more to our foolhardy little apprentice here than a simple expansion of her senses. She was able to turn the banshee mortal. This is beyond even the powers of a sage. For once, I agree with Celine, Alder said. We need to understand what's happening to Willa. Her newfound abilities could be of paramount importance if her dire vision comes to pass. Lily's eyes narrowed protectively. You're talking about my daughter as though she's some kind of defensive weapon. Holly placed a gentle hand on Lily's. No one wants to turn your girl into a weapon. But you know nature's balance. Poisonous plants usually grow in the same field as the plants that contain the antidote. If Willa's gifts can spot the sickness, given time and training, she may also ken the cure. The Contact Council's Dublin headquarters was an elegant, emerald green nano-glass edifice composed of 5 levels of arched chambers that formed a circular pyramid topped by a shallow dome that supported a slender communication spire. It rested amid lush green gardens and bubbling fountains that embraced visitors in an atmosphere of tranquility. Willa waited on one of the paths that meandered through the main garden, thoughts bubbling through her head like the water in a nearby fountain. Willa. Willa turned at the sound of Thorn's voice and ran to embrace him in a crushing hug. She pushed back, held him at arm's length, studied the bumps and bruises on his face from his journey through the maelstrom. If you ever do anything like that again. I thought I lost you. Everyone's talking about how you saved us, Thorn said. How did you do that? Apparently, I'm some sort of genetic freak, according to Holly. I'm sure she didn't say that. No, not exactly. But it's how I feel. Thorn kissed Willa gently on the lips. I want to hear the whole story later. Right now, they're expecting us inside. Willa nodded. They walked hand in hand down the path toward the council building and entered under the central arch. Inside, the main council chamber followed the building's circular motif. Seating for the council members and spectators lined the perimeter, while the open central floor was reserved for those who wished to address the council. On this day, Kale stood alongside Denik, Brim, Gar and Koro as they faced Brahma Kamal. 12 large luminaria globes floated in the air near the ceiling and transmitted the proceedings to the other council leaders around the world. Willa took a seat in the spectator section between her father and Rowan, who moved down so Thorn could sit next to Willa. Holly sat farther down alongside Rusalka, who returned a few stares from spectators who were surprised to see an elemental in the council chamber. Brahma tapped his nano-glass console. A clear, bell-like chime called the assembly to order. He waited for silence, then filled the chamber with his golden tone. We welcome our honored guests to Earth and express our deepest gratitude for the safe return of Captain Ashgrove. Who speaks for you? Denik took a step forward. With your permission, I'll speak on our behalf. Brahma gave Denik a respectful nod. How is it you speak our language? With all due respect, sir, how is it you speak ours? Denik said with a disarming smile. Brahma raised an eyebrow. I've always loved a good mystery, but we'll table that issue for now. Please tell us about your homeworld. It's called Zos, the center of a stellar empire ruled by a cruel archon named Asura along with his power-hungry overlords. They invaded our world a millennium ago and enslaved our people along with the inhabitants of 19 other planets. I and my fellow Zoshi are part of a resistance group called the Black League. He clapped Brim on the shoulder with pride. Including my son, Brim. We're here to ask for your help. To do what? Brahma said. To overthrow the archon. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Brahma tapped the bell for silence. Please forgive the outburst, Master Denik, but Earth hasn't had war for centuries. Although a few planets with the Alliance have maintained and repurposed their old military armadas, Earth has no such fleet. We're hardly equipped to fight one world, let alone an empire. You wouldn't have to fight. We ask only for supplies and weapons. We don't manufacture weapons. Your ships and your technology are beyond anything possessed by the Empire, said Denik. That alone would give us a great advantage. It would give us a fighting chance. Kale stepped up alongside Denik. Counselor Kamal, I've seen the conditions on their world. The planet is barely more than a prison. Food is scarce, freedom, non-existent. Surely there's something we can do to help their people, if only to give them some measure of hope. The council will discuss it and render a decision within 3 days, as per tradition. Brahma turned his gaze to Rowan and Thorn in the gallery. As to the matter of your son's recent behavior, we'll table that for now out of respect for your safe return. The council leader fixed the boys in his icy gaze. But make no mistake, there will be consequences. Brahma tapped the bell, rose and left the chamber. The other councillors faded from the luminaria and the spectators began to quietly discuss the issue among themselves. Denik turned to Kale. Is there nothing else we can say? I'll make sure they know all the facts, Kale reassured him. For now, you're my guests and I'd be honored if you'd share evening meal with my family. It would be our honor, Denik said with a slight bow of his head. He glanced at his fellow Orions. We'd also enjoy seeing more of Earth, while we have the time. I'll make the arrangements, Kale said. Rusalka turned to Holly as the gathering broke up. I saw nothing new here except disappointment in the off-worlders' eyes. What we learned, Holly said, is that Earth may have to go backwards in order to move forwards. The Puka wrinkled his nose in distress. You mean create weapons? I mean we may need to turn ourselves into weapons, Holly responded, none too happy that Alder's proposal to weaponize their abilities might be the only course open to them. What about Earth's security squads? Minor defensive weaponry, mostly for eliminating dangers such as asteroids. Certainly not enough power or ships to stop an invading army, Holly explained. Brahma said that some other worlds in your alliance might still have the ability to fight the off-worlders. Perhaps, Holly said. Several of the more recent member worlds haven't yet fully dismantled their defense fleets, which is a condition for entry into the alliance. But if we go down that path and wage all-out war with the Orions, it could take centuries for the alliance to recover. The 2 Earth squad ships orbiting Saturn approached Titan, the ring planet's largest moon, wrapped in its rust-colored cloak of noxious gases. Captain Sorrel, a dark-haired human, sat in his chair on the bridge of his squad ship, his slender fingers steepled in front of his slit of a mouth as he conferred over the view screen with his female hybrid counterpart, Captain Yarrow, in the second ship. They examined the unusual sensor readings on their monitors. Yarrow scanned the data with her caramel-colored eyes, trying to make sense of what she saw. I've never seen readings like these. What do you make of it, Starling? Starling, the ship's computer, processed the data through several algorithm filters. Based on the low-level random energy bursts, it appears to be an unknown natural phenomenon within Titan's atmosphere. Okay, Yarrow said, satisfied with the assessment. Let's do a full spectrum sweep and mark the location before we resume our patrol. The science division will want to take a closer look. Copy that, Starling said. I detect 2 non-random pulses rising toward the surface of the atmosphere. Yarrow furrowed her brow. Non-random? What? Before Yarrow could finish her question, 2 black, needle-like missiles broke through Titan's ruddy atmosphere and pierced both squad ships. They exploded into balls of incandescent light that scattered charred debris in all directions. Moments later, Haldane's stealth ship rose above the moon's soupy atmosphere. He piloted the vessel away from Saturn. In the pilot's cabin, Gant scrutinized the monitors. You're certain they sent no transmissions? None, Haldane assured him. Pulsing our engine at random intervals made us look like a natural anomaly. A trick I learned during the Takani uprising. I see why the Archon chose you for this mission. Just make sure you don't take all the credit, Haldane said without a hint of humor. He tapped his control panel, surrounded the sleek ship with a warp bubble and sped toward Earth at the speed of light. Chapter 14. Subterfuge. Stories of Earth's ancient wars are legion. One story in particular, the tale of the Trojan horse, teaches the lesson that things are not always what they seem on the surface, that death and defeat can disguise themselves in the mantle of victory. The Book of Paradox by Sassafras the Sage. A phalanx of Orion tech workers buzzed around the metal scaffolding that encased a sleek star cruiser in one of the Citadel's largest hangar bays. The ship bristled with a lethal array of weapons, plasma energy cannons, torpedo ports and electromagnetic spikes. Here and there, its black hull was penetrated by or patched over with glimmering crystalline technology stolen from the salvaged wreck of Kale's craft. Zos Asura strode into the bay. His gaunt frame was a foot taller than his obsequious aide, Dunaset, a pale, violet-skinned alien from Tet, one of the subjugated worlds within the Empire. Duna had bright red, bird-like eyes that darted everywhere and saw everything. He pointed a clawed finger at a group of techs to one side who were gathered around a crystalline cube about a yard on each side. The interface, my lord, Duna crooned. Zos Asura approached the techs, who quickly parted to allow the Archon an unobstructed view. They all gave a short bow of respect. Report, Zos Asura said. Yadra Jeet, the lead tech, also from the planet Tet, cleared his throat and chose his words carefully. This technology makes no sense, my lord. Perhaps the prisoner is feeding us false information? The Archon considered the possibility and quickly dismissed it. No. But perhaps the interrogators haven't dug deeply enough. She must still be holding something back. My lord is wise. The Archon turned and departed without another word, much to the relief of the techs, who were used to being blamed for both real and imagined inadequacies. Duna cast a suspicious eye on them as he followed his master from the hangar bay. Willa sat on a large, flat rock, her feet dangling over the edge. She stared at the burbling waters of the river that wound through the meadow at Three Rock Mountain. Holly approached from over a low hill, her silver mane blowing in the wind. She stopped a respectful distance behind Willa and wondered if she'd had enough time to digest the quorum's proposal. I know you're there, Willa said without turning around. I won't do it, I'm not a spy. No one's asking you to be. Just let us know if you sense anything out of place. I'm the one who'll be out of place. Won't they be suspicious? Why would I accompany them on the tour and leave Thorn behind? You helped bring them safely through the maelstrom. They'll welcome your company. And Thorn will only distract you from. Willa turned and threw a disapproving look at Holly. From what? My mission? Holly knew better than to respond. She turned her gaze to a mass of dark clouds that shadowed the horizon. It crossed Holly's mind that they might be a portent of things to come. She strolled over to Willa, sat beside her on the rock and stared in silence at the glistening waters that rushed by in the waning sunlight. "Tell me more about your vision," Holly said softly. Willa twitched as the image of the Archon standing over her broken body flashed through her mind. "I don't want to talk about it anymore." "Would you rather live it?" Willa's control began to erode as raw emotion exploded through the cracks in her stoic veneer. "Why me? Why am I the one who has to bear this? This so-called gift? You wanted to become a cryptic. Well, you were right. I'm not ready for this. It's too much, too fast." Holly wrapped an arm around Willa's shoulder. "I know. But you won't go through it alone." Willa leaned into Holly's embrace, tears flowing. "You didn't see what I saw. Your help may not be enough. The Quorum, the Contact Council, your family and friends. We're all here for you, for each other," Holly said. "Even the elementals, like Rusalka, annoying as he is, will help in any way he can." Holly sat Willa up straight, wiped the tears from her cheeks and gazed into her golden eyes. "Besides, there are things I have yet to teach you. Things I've learned about the Anu ancestors that I never shared with anyone, not even the Quorum." Willa's curiosity burned bright as her flame-hued hair. "What things?" "Knowledge that may help you master your newfound abilities. Things that could make all the difference if our encounter with the Orions leads to war." "Then teach me," Willa said. Holly allowed a smile. "All in good time, Willa. All in good time." Willa shook her head. "Based on my vision, I don't think we have much time." "There are no shortcuts to any place worth going," Holly said in cryptic fashion. "But lesson number 1 is to know that you know nothing." Willa blinked at her mentor. "I don't understand." "You can't fill a cup that's already full." Zos, Asura and Duna made their way down the cell-block hall. Guards gave a slight but respectful bow as the Archon passed by on his way to one specific cell at the end of the stone corridor. The steel cell door did nothing to muffle the agonizing screams that came from within. A guard opened the cell door, the Archon and his minion entered without breaking stride. Elowen Koa, the pilot of Kale's ship, her alabaster skin scarred and burned, lay strapped to a slanted steel table, very much alive despite the rumor the guards fed to Kale. She was immobilized by a metal cap with a wicked array of glistening needles that penetrated her skull. The Archon's 3 interrogators carefully manipulated the needles and ignored Elowen's screams as they watched the data from her tortured brain scroll across a bank of monitors. At a gesture from the Archon, one interrogator tapped a needle. Elowen immediately fell silent, her mouth agape, her face a frozen mask of terror. "My lord," the interrogator purred with a slight bow of his head. "Their ship's computer is not responding," the Archon said. "You will extract the secret of its operation from her before the change of the guard." "This is a delicate procedure, my lord. The slightest misalignment of the probes." "Probe deeper. It might kill her." "It matters not if she dies. But you best have the secret before she does or you'll take her place on that table." "Yes, my lord." The Archon turned and strode from the cell, Duna close on his heels. The door slammed shut behind them and Elowen's screams resumed, much louder than before. Willa, Kale and their Orion visitors hovered in the air in a nano-glass observation pod and gazed out over the cluster of islands that comprised the San Francisco archipelago and formed the entry to the Central Californian Inland Sea. The Golden Gate Bridge had been elevated, refitted and extended to reach from the northern tip of the main island to the southern shore across the wide bay. It was a walking bridge now, purely for pedestrian pleasure, as there was no need for ground vehicles to cross over since the advent of levitation technology. The remaining core of San Francisco was laced with platforms and bridges high above sea level. Dennick, Brim, Gar and Koro marveled at the city but were absolutely riveted on the ocean's vast expanse. "I didn't know there could be so much water on the surface of a planet," Brim remarked. "There are huge seas on a few of the worlds in the Empire, but this..." It takes your breath away, Dennick added. How much of the surface is covered? Gar said, his good eye opened wide. More than 3/4, Kale said, especially after most of the ice caps melted. Koro frowned, trying to imagine what Kale was describing. Ice caps? Sheets of frozen water at the poles, as thick as we are high right now. Brim nodded in admiration. This is an amazing world. I never imagined I would see anything like it in my lifetime. Dennick smiled and wrapped his arm around Brim's shoulder. It gives me hope for the future of zoos. Kale tempered his smile. I don't mean to cast a shadow, but the council hasn't decided yet whether or not Earth will join your cause. This may be a really stupid idea, Brim ventured, but can't our people just come live here instead? This isn't our world, Koro said, worried the suggestion might offend their hosts. Our people came from off-world as well, Willa interjected before anyone else could answer. Our hybrid race joined the humans who were already here over 700 years ago. That's true, Willa, Kale added in a somber tone, but our ancestors only numbered in the thousands. He turned to Dennick. How many slave worlds make up the Empire? 20, Dennick said. Over 100 billion souls. Willa refused to be deterred. But there are dozens of planets in the Alliance. A few are barely inhabited. Dennick shook his head. Kale's right. Even if we could somehow transport all those people to this sector of space, Zo's Asura's not going to just let us steal his subjects away without a battle that would cost millions of lives. No, the only way is to remove the Archon and his overlords and take back our home world. Only then will our people be free. Willa looked down at the waves below. She couldn't bring herself to believe there was no other way out for Brim's people and searched her mind for other options. The only path she could see was the one she was on, the one that led to her death. Willa hoped Holly was right, that she could use her newfound abilities to intuit a less dangerous path. Kale attempted to lift the dour mood in the pod. If you think the ocean is amazing, wait until you see the Rainbow Mountains of China. He tapped the coordinates into the controls and the pod shot off over the Pacific. As they glided over the water, Brim turned his attention to Willa. May I ask? I hope I'm not being too personal, Willa nodded for him to continue. Your world is home to humans, aliens and your people. Hybrids, I think you call yourselves? It's a long story, Willa admitted. I was just wondering. Your hair. Willa self-consciously ran her fingers through her thick fox fur locks. Oh. Yes, my parents explained it's a rare trait that crops up now and then in our family line. I take after my father and grandmother Mimsy. It sort of resembles the fur of an animal on our planet called a fox. I think it's attractive, Brim said. Willa blushed slightly, knowing that everyone in the pod could hear the conversation. Thanks, she said, her voice low. Their tour pod merged with a few others that were on a similar route, so it went unnoticed that one particular pod, with Thorn at the controls, followed them across the ocean.